Many distros that ship GNOME at this point default to the Wayland session, and I think we all know that GNOME is probably going to be the first major desktop environment that completely drops its X11 session, even if that Wayland side may not be completely ready. It's just a matter of when. So maybe, even though it's not ready at all, maybe it's time to ask that question, and one GNOME contributor tried to see it answered with 2 merge requests, starting with session, remove X11 session targets. This is the first step towards deprecating the X11 session. The GNOME Xorg desktop file is removed, but the X11 functionality is still there, so you can restore the X11 session by installing the file in the appropriate place on your own. So basically, as it stands by default, you wouldn't be able to launch the X11 session, but if for whatever reason you wanted it, you could re-add this file. It's effectively equivalent to like a build option. X11 has been receiving less and less testing. We have been defaulting to the Wayland session since 2016, and it's about time we drop the X11 session completely. Let's remove the targets this cycle so it'll be ready for the next release, and maybe carry on with removing the rest of the X11 session code next cycle, so the release after that, drop X11 entirely. Now, whilst they are defaulting to the Wayland session for a long time now, at least amongst the surveys that I've done, there are still quite a few GNOME users who are using the X11 session, and GNOME isn't really known as like the hacker's desktop, so having to add this extra file in just seems really weird from the GNOME perspective. Also, there was a pretty big bug with the first version of this. It didn't just remove the X11 session by default, it also broke X-Wayland clients, which is not the intention. There was work a while back towards adding in a build option to build GNOME without X-Wayland support, but in this case, that was not what was supposed to be happening. Now, following this, there's also the second merge request, draft remove X11 session code. In number 98, this one here, we removed the X11 session targets, deprecating the X11 session. Now it's time to also remove the code related to it. Remove all the code related to the X11 session. Farewell, Tombstone. Now, don't get your hopes up or maybe grab your pitchforks. This is not supposed to be merged for a long time. It's just opening the merge request now, so it's already here when it is ready to go. Whilst the emojis here show technically majority support, the comments tell a very different story, but even so, just looking at this, you can see there is some apprehension, we'll say. There's some mixed feelings about it. Now, with this first merge request, Michael Catanzaro makes it very clear what this is about. Reminder, here we're removing one 8-line text file that you can put back if you still really want to use X11. This is intended as a hard signal that it's past time to finish working on missing features, color management, VR, whatever else. I know there are many such issues, but it's not going to stop a sufficiently determined user from creating the text file and continuing on as before. Basically nothing is important enough to block this, as it's an important next step to make sure developers understand that GNOME won't support X11 for much longer, and features they care about need to be implemented ASAP. Now, I can understand this perspective, but the issues brought up in both of these threads are not things that third-party developers need to be signaled about. These are issues that are in GNOME itself that GNOME needs to address, and for some of them, they have already been addressed for a long time now on other desktops, and GNOME is the desktop lagging behind. So, let's start with a problem that isn't specific to GNOME. Wayland color management. Please don't drop X11 so soon. Wayland may be ready for many usages, but it's not for graphics professionals, at least as long as we don't have basic color management. See the Wayland protocol still being discussed. Then once it's done, we need an implementation in GNOME, so I don't expect this all to happen overnight. As maintainer of GIMP and member of GNOME, I really don't want to tell other pros that they should use something else. I know that there is this idea that pushing people to use Wayland will be a way to force software to update, but here, for instance, it doesn't depend on us, the software developers. The protocol is simply not ready, and the compositors, e.g. Mudder, don't have support. From the GIMP repo, there is absolutely nothing they can do to make this function work properly on Wayland. It is simply waiting on Wayland protocols to finish off the protocol and GNOME to actually implement it. Now, there is some level of color management that does exist on Wayland. This is sort of like a misunderstanding some people have. The problem is we're reworking a lot of stuff, we are working on this protocol, the tooling to actually set the profiles isn't exactly ready, plus there's the whole HDR stuff, so things are changing there as well. It's just a giant mess, and it's gonna be a while until things are, like, done and stable. Some requirements are getting done, things are coming into place, but it's not gonna be done next week, it's not gonna be done next month, it's still very much a while away. And we can't forget my personal pet issue, global hotkeys, which is important for things other than what I do with OBS. It is also important for accessibility with screen reader shortcuts, and there is some work going on to get this done, but right now X11 is just a better accessibility experience. Or if accessibility is not your thing, supporting push to talk. This has been a work in progress for a really long time, and you know, it's making progress. Right now, it's waiting on some global shortcut portal stuff. It's gonna be a while, but it's at least being worked on. And just for the record, Plasma has a solution to fix push-to-talk, so over there, it's not actually an issue. So, next problem. VR. Now, the VR issue mentioned isn't just VR being, like, you know, a bit flaky on GNOME. It's that it simply does not work on GNOME Wayland. Before this is merged, I'd like to see support for Valve's Index and other VR headsets merged and functional. Right now, it is not possible as GNOME does not have DRM leasing support. This works on KDE's Wayland session, but not GNOME at the moment. I believe that this should be added as a blocker for this pull request. Add VR support under Wayland. This was opened 2 years ago. And because this went absolutely nowhere for 2 whole years, Valve says in their own documentation for VR, don't use GNOME Wayland. Unfortunately, not all Wayland compositors support DRM leasing. It is not possible for SteamVR to function without leasing the display. If your window manager does not support DRM leasing, you will need to either use X11 or a compatible Wayland compositor to run SteamVR. Some compatible window managers and compositors include all X11 window managers and compositors, KDE Plasma Wayland, most WL Roots-based compositors, Sway, LabWC, Hyperland. I like whoever wrote this documentation. Notably, GNOME Wayland, the default desktop environment for Ubuntu, is not supported as it does not support DRM leasing. Users using GNOME Wayland will need to switch to an alternative window manager / compositor in order to use SteamVR. Workaround. Use the X11 session, or install KDE Plasma. The main contention here is GNOME wanted a portal. And nobody else wanted a portal. So everybody else just implemented it, and now GNOME's just here without working VR. There is another solution being worked on that does have a portal, but if that does get implemented, then it needs to get implemented on the other desktops, and there's not going to be VR support on GNOME for another maybe at least 2 or 3 years. Also, funnily enough, GNOME did initially approve the DRM leasing thing, so that's kind of why everybody went ahead with it. So now that everybody has it, they changed their mind and want to do something different. So, good luck trying to push Valve around. And besides VR, there is VRR, Variable Refresh Rate. I hope this won't be considered to be merged before VRR support is merged in Mutter for Wayland. As of today, the X11 session is still the only option for gaming. And you know what I always appreciate? Gaslighting and pretending like there is absolutely no issues with gaming on Wayland, especially gaming on GNOME. Just because you don't want to acknowledge the problem exists does not mean the problem goes away, and does not stop people being fully aware of the problem that exists. If GNOME doesn't want to support gaming as a use case, totally fair. Everybody can go over to Plasma, go and support the Plasma project. But let's not pretend like it's an equivalent experience. But, as we have previously talked about, there is work being done to get variable refresh rate working, along with supporting the tearing updates protocol to get rid of that forced vsync nonsense that has always been present in Wayland. Even though there are certain outspoken Wayland developers who don't know what they're talking about and think it is a giant waste of time, there are other developers that are actually trying to fix this problem. There is also issues with certain remote streaming. For example, Steam in-home streaming. This, I believe, is a problem just generally on Wayland, not specifically a GNOME thing. At least, generally on Wayland, minus GameScope, because that's actually the solution that people suggest now. Just use GameScope, and it works. Because of course, Valve is going to make their streaming thing work properly in their thing. Apparently, it still has some performance issues, but working is better than not working. And GNOME Remote Desktop isn't a solution for everybody. I already run a modified version of GRD, which forces software encoding to avoid chroma subsampling, which makes some of the text hard to read. This is a known about issue that's been known about for at least a year now, and it seems like it's been completely stalled. Now, the real fun part is the response from Joshua Strobel. This is the lead developer of the Budgie project. Now, the Budgie project is one of those projects that a really long time ago built off the GNOME stack. At this point, there is a lot of GNOME tooling they've had to fork because GNOME has gone off to do the GNOME thing. And this is probably going to be another piece of the puzzle. This is part of the full-on X11 removal, not just removing the text file. What do you expect the fallout to be of this removal for desktop environments which currently support X11 and leverage GNOME Session? Both Budgie Desktop and Pantheon Desktop, both of which are currently working to move to Wayland, currently only support X11. These desktop environments leverage GNOME Session for their session launching currently. If the removal of this supports launching of those desktop environments, then it seems premature for this support to be removed. Of course, I would not expect GNOME Session to maintain this until the end of time, but within the next GNOME cycle as an example, seems rather early for this to occur, and at least for us Budgie folks, would like to avoid having to fork another GNOME component and expending development effort that can otherwise be put into items like Wayland just to ensure our users across a wide range of operating systems with differing release cycles aren't negatively affected by this removal. And the response? Just fork it. Joshua comes back to say, you understand how disruptive this is to downstreams, right? And Michael Catanzaro comes in, once again, being the sane voice of reason. GNOME Session is simply not intended to be used by desktop environments other than GNOME. Many parts of GNOME are intended to be reusable by other desktops, but this is not one of them. It's really not reasonable to expect us to wait to drop X11 support until Budgie and Pantheon are ready to do so. And Joshua was not under the assumption that that was the case. What used to be an ecosystem of software for others to build experience on top of has simply become shifting sand, where any trust in the longevity of the usability of various parts of the stack has completely eroded. Based on current conversation, the impression given is that this is another circumstance where downstream consumers of GNOME technologies are not seemingly taken into consideration, trivially dismissed, and it does not appear from the current conversation that genuine concerns about the immediate removal of X11 are being taken seriously either, VRR seemingly being a non-goal/requirement as a blocker for this. Hopefully this impression can change, and some form of a compromise can be reached. GNOME has allowed this ecosystem to exist for a really long time. If they didn't want it to exist, that is something that should have been made crystal clear a long time ago. GNOME Session, much like Mutter and GNOME Shell, were never meant for others to use to build their own products. If Mutter wasn't meant for others, that's going to be a harsh reality for Elementary, seeing as they leverage it for Gala and will continue to into the foreseeable future. Budgie already soft-forked Mutter 43.x for a temporary branch before we move to WL roots. Elementary may want to consider something similar if GNOME is going to be as accommodating as you are currently. I digress. There's clearly little value for engaging further on this matter, seeing as the perspective of downstream evidently amounts to don't like it, fork it, rather than I can see how this is disruptive, that's really unfortunate, and not the desired outcome, maybe we can figure out a way forward, or set some reasonable timetable for this to be properly pulled without negatively impacting others. Once again, Michael Catanzaro, the voice of reason. I'm pretty sure GNOME 46, next release, is too soon to land this. MR98 is basically a jump scare, and we want to allow some time for users and developers to notice that before taking the next step, say 1 year. So I'll propose GNOME 48, that would reach users in March 2025. This is 8.5 years after GNOME switched to Wayland by default. And Joshua is totally fine with that. But Jordan just had to reply, calling the Budgie developers a bunch of entitled children. Why does that need to be in the issue tracker? What a value does that add? So that devolves into bickering between the two of them, because if that's the way the issue tracker is going to be, what's the point of actually having an important discussion? Let's just repeat the points we've already been saying, and eventually, maybe one of us will change our mind. Both Jordan and Joshua are very passionate about their stances, and are not willing to budge even an inch. Honestly, both of them just need to go outside, touch some grass, get some sunlight, chill out, come back to the repo at a later time, and then realize that we're just all trying to improve software here. It's just we have different approaches on how we're going to do so. Ultimately, GNOME dropping X11 is going to happen. It's not going to happen next release. It probably won't happen the release after that. It probably maybe won't happen the release after that. But it is going to happen in the very, very near future. And I expect the fallout to be pretty bad when it does happen. But for now, let's just wait and see if the issues are going to actually be addressed. So, are you a GNOME user? Do you think it's about time to drop X11? Or do you think there are issues that certainly still need to be addressed? Are some of the issues that I listed out issues that actually matter to you? I would love to know. So if you liked the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, LiberaPay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and I should go turn my air conditioner on. It's like 36 degrees Celsius in here. Bye.